and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode of Africa Today. We get you the latest news and events taking place on the African scene, and we will start off with our major top stories and reports. Sudan needs immediate action on hunger to avert widespread death. UN-backed report says Somalia parliament approves parts of election overhaul plan. More details.
Two recent expert reports supply evidence of Egypt's unique potential to benefit from a more fully implemented African Continental Free Trade Area AFCFTA agreement. They are helping to fuel much-needed optimism about the future of an economy battered by short-term geopolitical and other challenges that have led to symptoms such as 38% inflation last September. This came in a report by Washington, D.C.-based think tank and professor at the Thunderbird School of Management, a business school in the United States. It said for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises and larger companies, there are opportunities everywhere. The analytical reports were bookended by last year's $7 billion World Bank deal to support private sector jobs, health and education, and climate change adaptation. They are also supported by a new $5 billion loan program with International Monetary Fund (IMF) announced this month, which in turn came on the heels of a $35 billion accord with the Emirates Sovereign Wealth Fund (ADQ). After the IMF deal, the World Bank decided to chip in another $3 billion. The AFCFTA Egypt reports come from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD), a Paris-based club of rich countries, and the Trade Law Center Tralac in Western Cape, South Africa. Both suggest that Egypt is well placed to benefit from and help advance AFCFTA. AFCFTA became the world's largest regional free trade agreement when it was formally launched in 2021. The World Bank predicted that it could boost regional trade by 7%, meaning $450 billion, and lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty by 2035. While slow to gain momentum in trade volumes, partially due to the COVID lockdowns, the agreement has made strides on administrative, legislative, and diplomatic fronts.
Welcome back, dear viewers, and now we're joined over the phone by Ambassador Ayoub, Mahmoud Ayoub, former Minister Commercial. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon to you and to the viewers.
Sir, two recent reports supply evidence of Egypt's unique potential to benefit from a fully implemented African Continental Free Trade Agreement. How do you see the significance of this agreement, sir?
This is an important development and the right step in the right direction, because Egypt has a background in Africa. Egypt has done a lot with African countries from east, west, north, and south. So to cement and increase and bolster trade with the African countries is very important for both African countries and also for Egypt. Why? Because in many cases we find that we were importing African products, raw material, like copper and else, from other countries, third countries in Europe, for example. So when we are dealing directly between African countries, it is beneficial for both the exporter and the importer, for the African countries and for Egypt. So this is a right step in the right direction at the right timing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Sir, analysts say that for small and medium enterprises and larger companies, there are opportunities everywhere for Egypt under the African Free Trade Agreement. How would you elaborate on this statement?
To encourage African countries to have more intertrade between themselves, this means that we are benefiting the economies of both sides. One of the preconditions for this to encourage African countries and also Egyptian importers or exporters was to minimize as far as possible the import duties and the customs duties in each of these countries. So in many cases we find Egypt is a part and a member, a charter member in many blocks or say groupings or African economic groups in Africa, that makes it easier to have intertrade with the minimum of costs. Minimum of costs, I mean in this case, the transportation and also the custom duties, and which are levied by African countries and also by Egypt for foreign products. We can consider African products as intertrade, intertrade, and in this way we are cementing and we are supporting or increasing the volume of trade between African countries, beneficial for both of us.
Right. Sir, the analytical reports were bookended by last year's $7 billion World Bank deal to support private sector jobs, health and education, and climate change adaptation. Now, what in your opinion, why in your opinion rather, is the World Bank deal focused on those specific fields?
The World Bank is focusing on the most beneficial and most lucrative market in this respect. That is investment. African countries, all of them, from north and to the south, need foreign investment. When the World Bank is supporting this trend, this means that it is supporting the trend to increase interdependence between African countries, and at the same time encouraging foreign investors from outside the continent, to invest more in this lucrative market of 1.5 billion consumers. Not all population is not. It is in this sense it is consumers. So African investors, foreign investors, have a lot to gain from increasing investment, especially in the infrastructure and in industrial projects, in land reclamation and agro-industries. A lot to gain when we come to inter-African trade and African European or African American investment initiatives, which were initiated by Egypt at some time.
Right. Well, Ambassador Ayoub, now the Africa Free Trade Agreement, Egypt reports suggest that Egypt is well placed to benefit from and help advance the Africa Trade Agreement. Now, how can Egypt help advance this agreement?
When we change the African countries and with the African countries instead of other countries, this means that we're increasing the volume trade. That is the increasing which are coming out of the trade. At the same time, we are encouraging the private sector, which is very important in this respect, to venture to other markets in the African continent, so that they are making benefit from the bilateral or trilateral or multilateral trade agreements between Egypt and these countries. And this trend is quite beneficial to especially for the Egyptian economy, because we have exports, we have investment projects, we have joint projects, we have technology transfer, a lot of things which we are keen to increase with African countries.
Ambassador Ayoub, the reports say that the African Free Trade Agreement is the world's largest regional free trade agreement when it was formally launched in 2021. Why is that?
Free trade agreements means the flow of trade will be easier. The flow of trade will have less obstacles. The flow of trade will have less cost to the trading partners in African countries. So the flow of trade is very important to be increased, because the first beneficiaries of this increase of inter-African flow of trade are the African countries themselves, and that is why Egypt is having many initiatives in this respect, and the African countries are welcoming this step by Egypt.
Right. Sir, the World Bank predicted that it could boost regional trade by 7%, meaning that $450 billion and lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty by 2035. Now, how has this deal proceeded so far?
This is a very big and important deal. When we know that the foreign trade between African countries is just 7% of their foreign trade, this means that there is a big scope for African countries to increase trade and investment between themselves, and is the standard of living, it raises the economy, it supports private sector, and also it raises cost for fuel, not only to the World Bank, but also, which is very important, to the African countries themselves.
Right, sir. While slow to gain momentum in trade volumes due to the COVID-19 lockdowns, the agreement has made strides in administrative, legislative, and diplomatic fronts. Now, what manifestations would you mention in this regard?
After the COVID 2019, the international and the chains of supply were disrupted for some time. The best answer and the best response to this is increasing the trade between African countries themselves, because the war in Ukraine and also the COVID adversely affected international trade and many other sectors. So the right response is to increase trade between African countries themselves and make it a constant factor in the economic relations of the foreign economic relations of these countries. That is why Egypt has initiated many projects with African countries to increase trade and also to increase investment and increase that is to say increase economic cooperation between African countries, which is very important for the African countries. It will make them less dependent on foreign markets.
Right, sir. Cairo signed on in 2022 as one of 8 countries to do a fast-track test as part of something called the Guided Trade Initiative, or GTI, which pilots the agreement, preferential trade among 8 members of 96 identified commodities. Now, how important is this?
That is very important, not only for today, but also for tomorrow. Because we need, and African countries need to increase the inter-African trade, because it is quite important for them to be less dependent on other markets. African countries are big markets. African countries or African markets are very big markets for would-be investors and would-be foreign trade levers and factors. So to increase trade between African countries, this means that we are benefiting, first of all, the African countries and the African people themselves. That is why Egypt is putting all its effort in this direction, whether during the year when Egypt was the president of the African Union or later on. And that is why Egypt is doing its best in this respect, and African countries are welcoming this step by Egypt, and they are responding in a positive way, very positive way, to this initiative by Egypt.
Right, sir. In November, Cairo hosted the Intra-African Trade Fair that was organized here in Cairo by Afrexim Bank, and in collaboration also with the African Union and the Africa Trade Agreement. Now, the capabilities exist, as said by the trade fair, and the possibilities exist, but there are many obstacles. How would you list those obstacles?
First of all, there was the customs duties, which is now deleted or almost minimized. Second, transportation between African countries need to be bolstered, and we need more investment in this respect, whether in maritime lines or in land lines between Egypt, for example, and North Africa, between Egypt and South Africa, and through Sudan. So transportation is a very important consideration in increasing trade between African countries themselves. It is a big obstacle, but it is being handled now by many companies, whether Egyptian companies or even foreign companies. They are working between the African countries, helps trade between the countries, and Egypt is doing its best in this respect, whether Eastern African countries or Western African, until Nigeria and the other countries and the Angola and other countries in West Africa. So Egypt is benefiting very much and will benefit more when we increase transportation facilities between Egyptian ports and other ports in African countries. Even for the landlocked countries like Uganda and else and the Chad, they are benefiting from the easy transporting trade by land goods and land roads. It is helpful for these countries and also for the African continent to African economy as a whole.
Well, I would like to thank you so much, Ambassador Ayoub Mahmoud Ayoub, former Minister Commercial. Yes, with pleasure having the viewers. Now we move back to our special reports. You spoke over famine in Sudan. It said action is needed to prevent widespread death and the collapse of livelihoods in the following report.
A United Nations-backed Global Authority on Food Security warned that immediate action is needed to prevent widespread death and total collapse of livelihoods and avert a catastrophic hunger crisis in Sudan. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification (IPC) had been due to issue an update to its December analysis that found nearly 5 million people were on the verge of catastrophic hunger, but it was unable to do so due to the war. Instead, the IPC said it reviewed the latest evidence available and published the alert on Friday to express major concern about the deteriorating situation and to push for immediate action. War in Sudan on April 15, 2023 between the Sudanese Army (SAF) and Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces (RSF). The UN has said nearly 25 million people, half Sudan's population, need aid, and some 8 million have fled their homes. The U.S. warned on Thursday that it would push the Council to take action to get aid to starving people in Sudan, authorizing cross-border deliveries from Chad.
And on to Somalia. Somalia's parliament on Saturday unanimously approved proposals to overhaul the country's electoral system to reintroduce universal suffrage. More in the following report.
Last March, Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed pledged to end the complex clan-based indirect voting system in place for more than a half a century in the troubled Horn of Africa nation. The central government and 4 federal states later announced an agreement that a one-person, one-vote system would be introduced in local elections set for June 2024, but the proposal still had to be approved by Parliament. On Saturday, lawmakers approved 4 of the 15 constitutional chapters that are due to be amended as part of the overhaul. The President of the lower chamber of Parliament said the legislators from both houses unanimously endorsed the amended chapters of the Constitution. Analysts say the remaining 11 chapters are to be voted on later. Somalia is struggling to emerge from decades of conflict and chaos while battling natural disasters and a bloody insurgency by Al-Shabaab. The country has not had nationwide one-person, one-vote elections since 1969, when the dictator Ziad Barre seized power. The autonomous state of Puntland staged in May its first direct vote since 1969 during local council elections, but then went back to a complex clan-based ballot during parliamentary elections in January.
Viewers, that brings us to the end of this edition of Africa Today. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more coming up here on Now TV International.